Now it's my turn. Hello, my name's Jane Stewart and I'm from BizSafe. And I've been working with Joe to develop this event today. Today's theme is all about reimagining the future of responsible cafes. And we've gathered together some really interesting cafe leaders and experts to share their stories and their experience. We'll start by speaking with someone from the United Nations to give us a global perspective on some really key cafe issues. Then we'll talk to an expert, a coffee expert, who'll give us some key industry trends that are coming up. We'll hear from a cafe owner and listen to her COVID story and how she created a whole new business approach during the time. And then we'll listen to one of our own responsible cafe ambassadors who will discuss the concept of moral courage and how this relates to running a cafe. Then we'll bring the whole team together and we'll have a deeper discussion around our theme, which is reimagining the future of responsible cafes. So I hope you enjoyed the session and let's get started. So our first speaker is Janet Salem. Janet is the Economic Affairs Officer at the Circular Economy, Sustainable Urban Development section of the United Nations here in Asia Pacific region. Janet has been working with the United Nations for the last 15 years on environmental sustainability, and she focuses on circular economy and low carbon lifestyles. Janet has also worked extensively on sustainable food systems and campaigns on food waste prevention. So she's a perfect person to start today to talk to about global issues that affect the cafe industry. So we're really excited to have you with us, Janet. I was thinking perhaps the first thing you could do is tell us, what are you working on at the UN at the moment?
Oh, well, a lot of things. At the moment, hot topic is plastics. So working with cities in Southeast Asia on reducing the use of single-use plastic, and also if they have to be used, looking at how to invest in the right waste management systems so they don't become ocean plastic. And cafes are a big part of that. So it's really great to be here, not only to sort of share what we're doing, what we're thinking, but also hopefully to get some feedback from cafes on what we can do to help.
So what sort of things, when you say that, what does the UN actually do in this role? I mean, tell us about that. Tell us about single-use plastics.
Well, it sort of starts with a bigger picture, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN's a really big entity, and we're just there really to help countries or member states with how they reach sustainable development goals. What's relevant to cafes, I guess, in terms of plastic, is we really want to shift towards systems that are sustainably use natural resources. So this sort of linear idea of take, make, waste that single-use plastics is from would be contrary, or would be something we'd want to help countries move away from. But there's also a lot of goals dedicated to food. Food comes up in a lot of different ways. So not only health and access to food, but sustainable food systems, sustainable food consumption, and reduction of food waste. So it's once we had that framework in place in 2015, that meant that each country could develop its own plan to achieve those goals. So all countries, including Australia, have a plan towards achieving food sustainability or even reduction of waste. And it helps us work with those countries, but also helps us and other partners collaborate, because we have the common framework, the common understanding and common terminology about what we all want to achieve.
So around that common framework, what are some of the actions that you're doing or encouraging? Like, there's frameworks and there's sort of systems of thinking, but what about the action on the ground? How does the UN sort of encourage and work with people on the ground to do that?
Well, lots of different ways. Some of the ways I've worked on it is, my focus is Asia Pacific. And what I've seen is that even if you want to live a sustainable lifestyle, let's say you're coming up to a cafe and you've got some green values, it's often quite difficult to make those choices if you don't have the right options in the market. So I've been running a startup competition for startups that are able to provide low waste or low carbon solutions that are consumer facing. And so what we do is we help those startups with a small grant. It's never enough, but it is a grant. Some business partnerships so they can get some good technical and business know-how, some comms help. But then in return, what we're looking for them is policy advice. You know, what would you like us to tell policymakers as part of our advocacy on how we can make the system work better for you as a sustainable product provider? So there might be some, you know, when it comes to circular economy, there is a large overhead on that with the reuse and logistics, materials, etc. Especially when single-use plastics are so cheap, but waste management is still expensive. So they do have a cost, but the cost is sort of displaced in the system. Or like more recently, you know, concerns about hygiene around the pandemic has really gotten in the way of some startups that are providing on the reuse side. And on the food side, so that's been very interesting. We've got a lot of insights from startups, not as many from cafes. So that's why I'm really happy to be here. And on the food side, we've been looking at creating sustainable culinary journeys in conferences and large events. So what we noticed was, you know, we run a lot of conferences, and you sort of have that buffet where you sort of walk down the buffet and put a bit of everything in. So instead of that, we work with hotels and large venues to create a journey through different stations, whether it's the responsible seafood or the plant-based food, or the menu that's using kitchen waste creatively, or certified sustainably raised livestock, etc. So looking at using food and menus as a way of telling a story about sustainability and sustainable development goals.
It's interesting. I suppose when we hear that you're from the UN, it sounds very lofty and it sounds global and removed from a you know, cafe here in Australia. How can a cafe here in Australia get more connected to these, what you're, you know, this framework, the sustainable development goals, and make it sort of real to them in their day-to-day operation of their cafe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the UN is such a big organization, and, you know, sometimes think it's a very powerful organization and yet very powerless, because we don't physically control the way things are done, whereas a cafe owner does control their world. So, you know, we want to hear, you know, ideally, if the sector can come together and sort of pre-competitively or just collaboratively develop some policy briefs, so that well-meaning people, you know, working in environmental policy or health policy can understand how they can design solutions to make things better. We've got a few fabulous startups, or not sure if they're startups any longer, or very well-established businesses, but you know, there's also systems that are helping startups to grow, to incubate, to accelerate, and the people running those programs, it would also be great if you could communicate with them either through the Responsible Cafes Summit or network, to say, look, here's one of the problems. And I was learning from Joe the other week that a little struggle with reusable, bringing your own cup, is that the barista wants to write what your order is on the cup, and they can't really do it if it's your cup and not disposable. So it's just understanding little things like that we wouldn't have thought of as being critical to cafes, can be super helpful in designing solutions so that they can actually scale and take off.
Okay, that's interesting. There's no doubt through this summit series, not just today, but these other summit series coming up, we're really going to collect some ideas and innovations around cafes. So we can certainly collect it all and send it up back to you if that's the sort of thing you're after, are you?
Yes, and I particularly want to know, you know, from cafes that is fully on board, like I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Hannah afterwards, but from cafes that are on board, as well as cafes that are sort of, you know, interested, but they're sort of worried about money or logistics or whatever, we really want to hear the why not. You know, why wouldn't you pursue circular economy or a sustainable menu? Just not so that we can debate it, but so that we can understand what those problems are, what those barriers are to you, and again, find solutions and work with you to support you in a way that actually makes sense.
I suppose what would be fantastic is if we did start this dialogue between Responsible Cafe Network and you, is to somehow show people giving feedback that you were listening and taking it on board. I don't know, how could we do that? How could we show that this was happening, that we were actually putting, as a group, we were coming together and we were putting forward some ideas and you were taking them on board?
Yeah,
how could we do that?
Absolutely. I think if maybe in the final session of this summit, where we're really hearing from cafes, what would be useful is to note down, you know, what are the barriers to being a responsible cafe, in a way that can help a policymaker, probably at a city and state level, understand when they do develop those bans on single-use plastic or other relevant policies, what other things could help be embedded in that? Is it a subsidy or a levy, or is there better guidelines or training or a phased approach? So such a policy brief would be really useful. And then we also, at the UN, we have a global sustainable food systems program that's doing a lot of consultations. Anyone can host an event. So this is also something where if cafes in Australia wanted to get together or wherever and look at the framework that the UN is working on and sort of go through and say, yeah, that makes sense, or this one doesn't make sense, or can we ask that there be some more support in this form or that one. That's super useful because the consultation and stakeholder engagement, we call, it's quite heavy to do top down, but bottom up, it's always very welcome. So yeah, anything that we could hold an event together to sort of consolidate some of this feedback under the UN framework on sustainable food systems, which includes the consumption and retail of food, that would be super handy.
Okay, all right. I suppose we'll keep that in mind as we're running these different summits, because we would love to have some, continue the association with you so that you can put it out there and feed it up into the frameworks and the systems. Is there any last word you want to say here, Janet, to the crew, to the responsible cafes? Any last tips or thoughts that you would like to put to them?
Yeah, just if you really need to stick with a disposable cup, please use a biodegradable one. I love coffee. Love getting a takeaway coffee. I don't always remember my Husky cup, but it's really painful to use a plastic one. So I love the idea of the I'm not paper cup that we're going to hear from Sav. And otherwise, if you can make those reusable options available, either a Husky cup or a returner or any of those ones, there are so many startups there to help you. And they're struggling right now as well. So if you can work together with those solution providers, that'd be great so that we don't get set back because of this pandemic.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks, Janet. Thanks. It's lovely to speak to you. Thanks for giving us your time, and stick around because we'll talk to you a bit later in the group discussion as well.
Great. Thanks, Jane.